So first, maybe let me lay out the general structure of these 3 webinars. I'm going to put this here. So these follows the same structure of the Decoupling Debunked report, which you can see the cover here, which was published in July 2019. So as Dag was saying today, we're going to deal with the most technical part, laying down the terminology of decoupling and green growth, understanding really what we're talking about, giving ourselves an analytical framework that will allow us after to dig into the numbers, to dig into the modeling scenarios, as to be able to answer that great question, which is, can we decouple GDP from environmental pressures? So today is perhaps not going to be the most thrilling of the 3 webinars, and many of you will be eager to dive into the numbers, but I believe it is well worth the investment. And actually, that's the claim I want to start with. I decided to write this report because the discussion around decoupling were so messy. People were saying, oh, we have decoupling here and we have decoupling there. We have a bit of decoupling. We don't have no decoupling, but they each had a different conceptual framework. And so we didn't really know decoupling of what, how long, how big, what does it mean? And so there was just, we're swimming in an ocean of numbers without really being able to answer that question and to make political decisions based after this. So what kind of policy should we have if we can or if we cannot have green growth? So today, I think we're going to spend a bit of time to give ourselves the tools to clarify this discussion. Then next week, we're going to look at all the numbers available as of today. And here we'll bring new numbers that, of course, became available since the summer of 2019, where the report was published, to look at, is decoupling happening, or at least has happened until now? And part 3, we will get into the models, the scenarios, the theories, the hypotheses concerning the future. Okay, based on part 2, if decoupling is or is not happening today, what is likely to happen in the future? What kind of policies are currently in place to foster decoupling or other things? And how is that working? So that the general outline of what we're going to do. And before getting into that part 1, I wanted to give a bit of a broader context of that report, which you can see on the left, Decoupling Debunked. So the origin of that report was actually a chapter of my PhD dissertation, which you can see on the right, which I wrote in a French university and at the Stockholm Resilience Center. And so that the political economy of degrowth is a thesis in theoretical economics that go way beyond decoupling, but one of its chapter, which was chapter 2, was on the question of green growth. And part of this chapter, only one section, as you can imagine, this is a very bulky, long thesis. One of that section was about the decoupling controversy. And I wrote that, again, with the same structure and exactly the same content as in the report Decoupling Debunked, except there was no section 2. So it was only the conceptual framework to understand decoupling, and then the is decoupling likely to happen in the future. There was no empirical review of studies on decoupling. We added this with my co-authors in the report. But back then, I still felt it was absolutely necessary to clarify the decoupling question once and for all before we can move on to discuss either green growth or degrowth. And the report I remember discussing with a few people at the post-growth conference at the European Parliament in September 2018. And I was telling them, oh, look, I'm writing my PhD and I think I've got a pretty good framework to clarify all those discussions about decoupling. And so with a few people, we decided to turn that chapter into a report, which I guess many of you have seen, and that became Decoupling Debunked in July 2019. I didn't expect that it would get the popularity that it had, but it did. And so that stimulated a lot of discussions around green growth and degrowth. So that's the basis that we have here. And of course, as you will understand, I wrote Decoupling Debunked from the perspective of degrowth. Let's say my starting point was I was kind of skeptical of green growth. And so later in the discussion, and especially in part 3, when we'll come back to critique of green growth strategy, you will have to remember that this has been my positioning since the beginning, because of course, nothing is completely scientifically objective. We always write from a perspective, and so this is mine. And at some point, I think during webinar 3, or perhaps in the question time today, I can take time to clarify why do I mean by degrowth and how it relates to green growth. But as of now, a bit of context on the idea of green growth and decoupling. So decoupling was born in empirical studies in the 90s when a few economists were doing empirical studies, trying to plot, making curves like this. This is the 2 original decoupling studies from 91, 93, where they were looking at, look, you know, we're going to look at deforestation and compare it to GDP per capita. Or we're going to look at specific pollutant or emissions or water use, a whole different kind of environmental pressures. And what these people discovered is this inverted U curve, which became known as the environmental Kuznets curve. And for them, that was an empirical discovery. They were like, oh, wow, that's interesting. Look at what the numbers told us. So they didn't come with a theory telling them that, oh, you know, as a country gets richer, it gets less environmentally intensive. It's something they read into the numbers. And that's from these studies that the concept of environmental Kuznets curve emerged, which you can see here. So in pre-industrial economies, we have a coupling between environmental degradation and GDP. As a country industrialized, that coupling intensifies, a lot of pollutions, a lot of resource use until we reach the peak impact. And then a country deindustrialized, became a service economy, invest in eco-innovation, and so goes the story. And here we have a decoupling where GDP can continue, but where environmental pressures decreases. So that was a hypothesis from these studies that they looked at, wow, you know, based on what we've looked at deforestation on a period of 10 years in that country, we hypothesized that perhaps all kind of environmental pressures follow the same type of Kuznets curve. For the economist, those of you that are not economists, Kuznets refer to Simon Kuznets, American Russian economist and inventor of the GDP in the 1930s. And the Kuznets curve is about inequality. Same curve, same thing, inequality increase first as a country develop, and then it comes to decrease in the end. So that's another hypothesis that also been debunked by Thomas Piketty recently. So unfortunately, the 2 Kuznets curves has been falsified to my perspective. We'll come back to this. So comes the beginning of the 2000s, where decoupling becomes a policy goal. So in 2001, the OECD is the first organization to really set decoupling as a major pillar of environmental policy. What is interesting historically is that 1 year after, in 2002 in France, is also the birth of the concept of degrowth. So I like to call it the war of the D words, decoupling versus degrowth. And we'll discover that these 2 concepts have been battling, decoupling showing that degrowth is wrong and degrowth trying to show that decoupling is wrong ever since the beginning of the 2000s. And hopefully by the end of these 3 seminars, we would have seen many numbers and concepts to help us understand that debate. So decoupling become a policy goal, gets adopted by the World Bank, UNEP, the European Commissions, various countries, more and more empirical studies on the matter of decoupling. As of now, there's been a bit over 850 empirical studies on decoupling since that initial one in 1991. So it's a large literature, but not enormous either. So what I will be presenting in the second part of that webinar covers the entirety of empirical studies available. So you can have an overview and we can really see what kind of proof do we have of decoupling. I've put 2015 here because I think there's been a shift with decoupling being included in target 8.4 of the Sustainable Development Goals, which you can see here, endeavor to decouple economic growth from environmental degradation. It's here, I'm picking 2015. It's symbolic and rough, but I think it represents the decoupling becoming hegemonic in environmental policies, where people now, like green growth is what is expected to happen. With a few countries we'll see achieving certain forms of decoupling, I think it has now become assumed that decoupling GDP growth from environmental pressures is part of what developing is about. And as any countries will go in getting richer, they will automatically and or through policy making get into the way of green growth. It's important to say this because that positioned the debate in the sense of today, the common sense is to believe that green growth is happening, and so degrowth has the burden of proof, so to say, in showing that this green growth might not be happening. So we're starting with this a bit unbalanced debate, which makes it quite thrilling because the question is so important. I didn't have time to say it, but perhaps I should state it now. The opposition between green growth and degrowth for me is the most important debate about sustainability in the 21st century as of now. It is really the one debate that encapsulates every question about sustainability today. So this is not something technical in the periphery of sustainability discussions. I believe this is really something that gives us an overview of the ideological landscapes around political ecology in the 21st century. So let's get started because we have much work. Here I've put you the target 8.4, where we really have decoupling being noted as a specific goal. I've put you the European Green New Deal, self-defined as a new growth strategy. That's the first word that they use to describe that piece of policy from the European Commission. And one of its main pillars is decoupling economic growth from resource use. What I'm trying to show here is that if you go and dissect national environmental policy, regional and international environmental policy, you will find decoupling everywhere. Decoupling or green growth are associated synonyms. This is why it makes it so thrilling that if somehow we have made a mistake about our expectation of green growth, it means we have to redraft the entirety of all environmental policies in the world. So we really need to get that answer right. As I said, it's a great debate. So there's been a lot of effort trying to disprove on the degrowth side, showing that green growth is a myth, an illusion, something to be debunked, a false belief, whatever you want. And on the other side, the same thing, people that have been trying to debunk the thesis of degrowth, which is basically to discredit the thesis of green growth. So here you see like degrowth is wrong because it is wrong in showing that we're wrong. So it gets very tangled up, and hopefully we can get back to this in the discussions. Here I've just put you a good opposition between Andrew McAfee and Jason Hickel. Andrew McAfee on the green growth side, Jason Hickel on the degrowth side, with these two short articles really showing the opposition. And even better, there are books. I mean, look at the titles. Jason Hickel, Less is More, and McAfee, More from Less. Here we have in one single shot the opposition between degrowth and green growth. And now we're going to get into some terminology to better understand it. Some of you that have seen the report, you perhaps remember this figure, which summarizes the first section, where what I wanted to design is a bit of a checklist for every time someone makes a claims about decoupling, either that there is decoupling or that there is not decoupling. I wanted to have this checklist to make sure of like, what kind of decoupling are we talking about? So see this a bit as a how-to manual, how to read a decoupling study that allow us to really get the knowledge out of it without just ending up with vague claims. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to use the 30 minutes that I've left to go through each of these points. And I'm not going to give you examples of each of that because we're going to do this in the second part when we get into the real numbers about decoupling. So in the second part, I will always be coming back using these terms, being like, look, this is relative, this is local, this is decoupling, this is recoupling. So now we invest in the concept. And then, of course, next webinar, I will remind you of these, but in case you have forgotten in 1 week about them. So 6 dimensions to understand what kind of decoupling we're talking about. And I'm going to start right in with the choice of variables. So if we're talking of decoupling mathematically, we need to decouple something from something else. And so that's here that starts the first difference, is like, what do you pick as a variable of economic activity? And what do you pick as an environmental variable? To be easy, we can call it the economic curve and the ecological curve. Most often, if not in all of the cases, I think, of decoupling studies I've seen, they pick gross domestic product. Here's a little reminder. I'm not going to get into this of what GDP is. It's an aggregate measure of production used through, let's say, the summing up of the total market value of whatever is being produced within a year. So that concept has many limits, and we can get back to it in the discussions. I think from my perspective, that is why also we should be worried of decoupling GDP from something, because talking of GDP is already framing the debate within the limits of that particular indicators, which I'm sure many of you have heard some of its limits, starting with the fact that it doesn't include any difference between desirable activities and undesirable activities, that it doesn't account for the depreciation of natural capital, and that it does not value anything that has no price. So it's not a full measure. It's an estimation of production, but it's one that's being used in all the decoupling studies. So we have to deal with that, at least as we critically look at these studies. And then I think in the third part, or in the discussion, we need to broaden up and ask ourselves, how would these studies look differently if we were to choose a different variable of economic activity? And here I'm going to show you different variables. I think, Doug, we had exactly the same graph. Well, I've got it in a different way, but this is here looking at, we have material footprint per capita as a measure of environmental pressure, and we have the Human Development Index. So not only GDP, but another indicator, including health and education alongside GDP. There's this study that is more mainstream, where here we can see is just GDP per capita versus ecological footprint. So you would say this is the classic decoupling study on GDP. This one takes the ECU, which is one of the first alternative to GDP developed in the 1970s. So here just showing you that there's been a few studies that have ventured in picking a different variable, but as of now, we'll not pay too much attention to this. Same thing here, where we're not looking at GDP per capita, or not even a measure of economic welfare, but just social thresholds being achieved. So in another study, and I think there is a trend. These are very recent studies. Now there's a trend. The more and more we understand the limit of GDP, the more and more people transition to doing, picking other indicators of social welfare instead of GDP in decoupling studies. So now that makes it way more complicated for us to answer the question about green growth, because of course that mingles with other indicators. So GDP per capita will be our main economic variable during these 3 webinars. That's easy. The ecological curve is way more complicated because it represents environmental pressures. So now, by training, I'm an ecological economist. So I follow the approach of Herman Daly, the American economist that used to talk about throughput. So to see an economy like a metabolism, like your body. And so your body is connected to sources of natural resources and also to sinks. And there is a biophysical flow going through you, enabling you to function, and you take things from nature and you put back things from nature. Same thing about an economy. And on both these sides, we can have what we call pressures. You can take too much resources, you can overfish, for example, and cause a problem at the level of the ecosystem. And you can emit too much pollutions, like climate change is a good example of over-emitting carbon. So here, when I speak of environmental pressures, and this is a well-known definition, this is not mine, but I include all the consequences an economy has on nature. And that's an important point because we will soon after realize that decoupling often pick one single environmental pressure, leaving the other unstudied. I think I've got an example of this. Yeah, okay. So that already gives us two kinds of decoupling. The source decoupling, remember I talked about sources on the side of resource use and sinks on the side of environmental impact. So a source decoupling would be a decoupling from GDP from the use of natural resources, things, for example, the extraction of material. And a sink decoupling would be decoupling GDP from any measure of environmental impact, like greenhouse gases. And of course, as ecologists, we understand that for decoupling to be a viable strategy and for green growth to be something viable, we need to decouple everything. So not only greenhouse gases, not only decarbonizing, not only doing circular economy by reducing the extraction of materials, but including every single way we affect the environment. If we miss anyone, then we have an issue. At least that's the framework I use in Ecological Economist. And you can disagree with it and we can come back to it, realizing that perhaps some environmental pressures are more important than others, some are more urgent than others, and this is complicating the task ahead. So here, I'm making a quick difference between partial and total decoupling. Partial decoupling would be just decoupling one environmental pressure. Let's say, okay, cool, we have less and less deforestation. Well, fortunately, that's not the case globally, but let's say at the level of one country, we're managing to decouple GDP from deforestation. So we've achieved a partial decoupling of economic activities from, well, just deforestation, but that does not mean that we have decoupled GDP from the extraction of mineral, from water pollution, from air pollution in cities, from the generation of municipal waste, whatever you can think about. So every time you see a decoupling studies and they show you a curve, usually there's one curve GDP, one curve's environmental pressures. Ask yourself, what kind of indicators of environmental pressures? And I think in the future, if we want to improve knowledge about this issue, we need to include a diversity of environmental pressures. And then, and that we come back to this in the discussion, we could do the same for GDP. If we disaggregate, for example, different type of economic sectors, we could see that some sectors get decoupled from some environmental pressures and others are not, which will allow us to do way more precise economic policies. But that's really here, we're in the future. Empirical, the state of empirical science about decoupling is far away from this. So I'm showing you here an article which is the first exhaustive literature review of decoupling studies. It was published in June 2020 by a large group of authors, and they've reviewed 835 articles, empirical studies about decoupling. And here what they show is that most of these studies focus on two forms of pressures, which is, greenhouse gas emissions, and most of the time, only CO2, and then measures of energy use. So if you're looking for studies on decoupling concerning biodiversity loss or extraction of mineral or the generation of e-waste or something very specific, you won't find them, which is a problem to answer the question. So then, as we cannot answer this question with numbers, we will have to try to answer it with models and theories. And so we'll push back in part 3 of that seminar. But here I just wanted to show you that here we have a lot, we should have a lot of environmental pressures, but in practice, in the studies available, we only have a few. Now, another important division, and I will try to slow down. I know I speak rather fast, and I'm feeling sorry for the translator, so I'm going to try to relax and to speak a bit more slowly. Here, making the difference between the way we measure, let's say, the geographical boundaries of a decoupling study. So there is here a critical division between territorial or production-based, and footprint versus consumption-based. Take, for example, a country like France. So what does it mean to measure the environmental pressures of France? Do you take everything that is being produced in France? Or do you also include everything that's being consumed in France, including the things that have been produced elsewhere? So that's the difference between the approach. Territorial approach, you only include what is being produced within the boundary of your country. So if you're a high income country like France and you import a lot of your consumption, all of that is not going to be on your ecological footprint if you use territorial indicators. That's a problem because then you can see if you delocalize the most polluting industries elsewhere, that looks like decoupling. But of course, at the global level, there is no decoupling because the things, the car you use to produce at home are being produced in another country, usually with lower environmental standards. And so pollution still rise. So I think today, most people realize that we should include footprint indicators that take into account all the life cycle of whatever is being consumed in a country, which is a better measure of affluence in one way. But this is only very new. So this consumption-based approach only appeared in 2012. This is why when in this exhaustive literature review of decoupling studies, they tell us that 92% of all studies ever made use territorial measures. And so very often, when we see numbers claiming, wow, look, UK has decoupled, if you look at footprint, if you replace territorial indicators by footprint indicators, you realize that what look like absolute decoupling become relative decoupling or actually completely disappear. So here there is that becomes a bit complicated because now we have to redo all the studies we previously did before 2012, including a new, more precise footprint indicators. So you see there's a lot of work for decoupling for environmental scientists. Now, another important point is that decoupling in general, as you understand the term mathematically, is like we want one curve to go away from the other. There are two ways of doing this. On the left, environmental pressures can stay the same, and then you can create a lot of GDP. So let's say, you're in a country like France, and you're not changing anything to your process of production, but you have a boom in the financial market. And that boom is somehow generating a lot of financial transactions that get recorded in GDP as production. So GDP goes up, which means that the environmental intensity of every euro in France goes down, which looks like decoupling, but your environmental pressure have not changed at all. So here, that's a GDP-driven decoupling. And of course, if you're a sustainability scientist, that's completely useless because the goal is to make environmental pressures decrease. So what we want is a pressure-driven decoupling. Whatever needs to happen is for the ecological curve to go down. And now this can go down in many different manners. This is perhaps the most important division here between relative and absolute decoupling. This graph is a bit confusing, so let me drive you through it. You have the GDP on top, the red line. And let's say you have environmental pressures following the pink line. That's typical coupling. 10% more GDP, 10% more environmental pressures. So they're beautifully coupled. Let's say that GDP increase, but environmental pressures decrease a bit. That's the yellow line. As you can see, they're still increasing in time, but relatively less than they were in the past. And so we call this relative decoupling. Your economy is getting relatively more efficient, but still because it keeps growing, it gets bigger, that growth overcompensates for the efficiency gains that you've had through whatever sobriety or eco-innovations or changes of production or transition to services. It doesn't really matter at this point what has caused you to decrease environmental pressures. So now all of this is relative above the absolute decoupling point. This is the absolute decoupling point, the point below which environmental pressures decrease absolutely, meaning that they really go down, not only relative per euro, just absolutely if you measure them now and in 5 years, they'll be lower in terms of tons of waste, in terms of particle emissions, in terms of whatever you want. Then, of course, it can be of different kind. You can have a very small absolute decoupling. Let's say GDP keep increasing and you have minus 0.3, almost nothing. As if it's under the line, if it's negative, then it's absolute decoupling. But as you can imagine, there's nothing worth sabering champagne if you've just decreased anything of a few 0.0%. So here, to really understand what needs to happen, we need to place a line here represented by my red planetary boundaries line, which correspond to your environmental target. So now you remember I've said that there's just many different environmental pressures. So it means there's many different environmental targets. But here's the point that we need an absolute decoupling that is fast enough and big enough. Here we'll focus on the big, meaning like it needs to decrease to the point where actually we get back to, it can be, a one planet ecological footprint. It can be within a specific carbon budget. It can be within a specific, target of land use, a specific target of biodiversity loss. Whatever you have as an environmental policy is that red dotted line you need to go under. Here, I'm showing you one of the few studies, empirical studies that have used this conceptual framework. I find it quite surprising because most empirical studies, they look at what they call, carbon intensity. So, the content of carbon per euro. And so they talk about this very abstract sense of efficiency, which doesn't really speak to us as a sustainability scientist, because we understand that when we're dealing with the natural world, we're dealing about absolute numbers, carbon particles in the atmosphere, number of fish in an ecosystem, number of trees, number of microorganisms in the soil. It doesn't really matter how that does in proportion to the size of your economy, which is an abstract concept. So here in this study, they make the difference between relative decoupling, good, point for effort, absolute decoupling, okay, it's getting good, it's getting down, but an absolute decoupling within resource limits, which is actually the one that we want. It's the path of getting back to a sustainable scale. So here, I've made the point that different pressures meet different thresholds, and they're not all at the same level because they're not all measured with the same thing. So you guys remember Johan Rockström planetary boundaries framework from 2009 with the 9 boundaries. I think now we can even name some more of them, and each of them with specific indicators. So now, if we really are serious about the idea of decoupling and showing that green growth is a viable path, we need to show that GDP can increase while all measures of environmental pressures decrease absolutely, and that decrease is large enough to actually get us down the level of sustainable resource use or sustainable environmental impact. And now, another things, I hope this is not too much by this point, and I can perhaps synthesize before the end, but I need to include, it's not only a matter of size, it's also a matter of speed. I mean, think of climate change. If I tell you that, okay, at that rate, we can decouple, absolutely, and to a sufficient level, but it will happen in 2100. Then you'll tell me, well, that's not a viable environmental policy, because the IPCC is telling us we absolutely need to decrease emissions before then. This is why the speed of decoupling matters. Same thing if I'm thinking about resource use of a fishery, for example. Well, we need some time to just decrease the consumption very fast to avoid a collapse of that specific ecosystem. Same thing for aggregated non-linear pollutive activities, like the disturbance of a forest. where you can, cut some trees, and all is fine. And then at some point you reach a boundary where there's not enough tree, and let's say the forest become very fragile to forest fires, and then you have an ecosystem collapse. So here in the way we're designing, or let's say rather interpreting, the way we're reading the decoupling studies, we need to introduce the concept of speed into it. Is it big enough? Is it fast enough? Okay, and that's last point of these 6 dimensions. Remember I was talking about concerning decoupling, and that's the one about the fairness or the equity aspect of decoupling. If everyone on Earth had the same ecological footprint, then it would be completely fine to have this discussion, and then we would be literally all in the same boat as in the discourse of the Anthropocene, us as a human species, just, using resources and emitting pollutions. Problem is that we see in the numbers that most of the pollutions are generated by high-income countries, historically and still now. And so the footprint that here you can see from the emission gap report of 2020, comparing, the richer people on the planet, or even, the 10% richest, and the bottom 50% is enormously different. So that gives us a challenge, because of course we remember the Sustainable Development Goal, and solving environmental issues is not a monolithic task. It is completely linked to other objectives, starting with the eradication of poverty. So now we have to think about how can we both eradicate poverty and remain within planetary boundaries, and how does that fit with decoupling studies? So when I read a decoupling study that say, even if it said, oh, look, France managed to have relative rates of decoupling, and so it's slowly getting into the way of carbon neutrality, I would be wondering, like, okay, but does that include, let's say, the extra effort of being able to reduce emissions and resource use as fast as possible, as to liberate a bit of the carbon budget for the development of the global south? And here we can see that this is a political angle, but this is something you don't see very often in decoupling studies. So we congratulate ourselves for very small achievements of decoupling without taking into account the historical responsibility of the global north. Here's the paper from Jason Hickel showing that, 92%, if I remember well, but let's say like the great majority of all excess CO2 emissions has been created by high-income country. So now here we have a convergence of 2 discussions, the one about climate debt and the one about decoupling. So that reminds us that is not only about, what's going to happen in the next 10 years, it's about what's going to happen globally in relation to what has already happened since the beginning of at least global warming, not the beginning of global warming, the beginning of environmental concerns in the 70s. And here, that's another dimension I did not even speak about, but that's an obvious one between local and global decoupling. There's very little use in managing to decouple Switzerland, GDP in Switzerland, and emissions of greenhouse gases if everything else stay coupled. And in seminar 2, I'll bring a lot of numbers to show you the difference, and I'll do a map showing which countries have achieved what kind of decoupling and which others have not. And what we realized is actually there are more cases of local decoupling are actually quite rare. So here we need to remember that many of these environmental pressures, I'm thinking notably of climate change, are global issues. So we have to keep track of global indicators. Others are local. If you're looking at decoupling of municipal waste, then of course, you have to take a measure not of national GDP, but of a specific city. And I should say that in the Abel and Al study of June 2020, they only took national, regional, and international empirical studies. So there remains to be done a targeted literature review of all sub-national empirical studies to look at these specific questions. So Oh, wow. And I thought I was done, but I was not. There's another dimension coming out of nowhere that has to do with the notion of recoupling. So here it's also about time. If you take decoupling studies and you pick indicators going from, let's say, 1990 to 2010, and then you see, let's say, the first two parts of this curve, you see an environmental Kuznets curve, environmental pressure going up and down. And so you're like, okay, great, look, we're decoupling. But if you take between 1990 and 2020, including 10 more years of data, perhaps you realize that there's been a recoupling of GDP with environmental pressures. This happens a lot, and we'll see in webinar 2, when you have an energy transition. When a country, for example, goes from coal to gas,